I was just speaking with Nate about the importance of ethics in the classroom, but in addition to in the classroom, in life in general. With ethics, you're not just talking about ethical theories. We're also talking about leadership. We're talking about integrity. So we're going to cover a lot of that today, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. So our objectives is just understanding ethical standards and how to implement them into the classroom. Managing the classroom is a huge benefit and something necessary at the beginning of the course before you even start to set your standards. Define leadership and promote effective leadership strategies, and then to utilize scenarios in the classroom to bring out the ethical and leadership values in students. So when we get to, I have several scenarios in here, and obviously this would be much easier to do if we were in person so we could have some interaction back and forth. However, this is an area that you can work on in your classroom itself, and I hope this helps. So the late great Nelson Mandela said that education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world, and that is so true. And it's unfortunate that we no longer have his words of wisdom, but his previous statements we all can learn from. So I said earlier about classroom management. Do you have your students help you with setting those rules for the classroom, how improvement expectations may be met? Those are all good ideas to do while you all have your syllabus prior to the classroom even starting, allowing them to help you set those minimum standards. That way they can take some ownership with their behavior throughout the class. So setting the standard for what is acceptable behavior, what's expected regarding behavior and respect, processes for improvement, instructor consistencies. One-on-one conversation should begin at the first violation of the set rules. Honesty and integrity should be the first lesson that the student understands and agrees to. Consistency by the instructor for behavior modification has to be a priority. And as a state regulator for EMS education, I often get complaints from students saying either the instructors or the program director did not follow their own rules that were written in the syllabus or created in the beginning of the class. Or the other big complaint I get is that they're not consistent, meaning you're treating different situations and maybe different people separately. So setting those standards is important with classroom management. Since we're talking about ethics and leadership and professionalism, let's add integrity to this mix, right? Doing the right thing. Do you talk to your students on the first day of class about this? Cheating on tests, assignments, those are always concerns. We'll talk more about that later. But do they really leave the classroom with a thorough understanding, excuse me, of what integrity is? What about discussing this with them before they even begin their clinical rotations? Attitudes of preceptors, those might be a little poor occasionally, but they can still learn from that. What about the last day of class? Before you let them go out into the world, do you spend some time talking about being honest, having high ethics, having integrity? Remind them that the people that they care for will always remember them, not necessarily for their skills, but instead by how they were treated. And it's important that each student knows that before they leave the classroom. So the definition of integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. Things like taking responsibility for their actions, putting others' needs above their own, offering to help others in needs, giving the benefit of the doubt, choosing honesty in all things, showing respect, and manifesting humility. No one likes to make mistakes. I often say that experience, the word experience, is just a fancy word for mistakes. We all make them. The important thing is that we can learn from them and then move on. There are so many words for ethics. When we're talking about ethics, we're talking about principles, integrity, morality, conduct, true, honest, conscience, honorable, professional. Uh, we always say that we want DMS to be known as a profession and not a trade. How do we accomplish this? And it all begins with ethics, honesty, integrity, and so on. So let's talk about a scenario. Day one of lab. Students are just learning how to do assessments. Let's take a look at this particular scenario. So you and your partner are best friends. You arrive on scene of a possible overdose. The patient is awake, they're able to talk. And your partner, who's also your best friend, is looking at the medication bottles for documentation purposes, writing down the names of the medications, and you see them put one of those bottles in their pocket. So if you're setting this up on the first day of EMT or paramedic school, you're going to have that partner, if you will, that best friend, know to do this. How would that student handle that situation? If you start working on ethical scenarios on the first lab day, the first day of lab, you're going to get them thinking about this. So how could you get your students to work through this? How is your lab instructor going to help them head toward the right way of handling this situation? It's very important to do that. I do that with every one of my classes. Every one of my classes start out with an ethical scenario similar to this. And we usually have very good conversations about it afterwards. They don't always make the right decision, but that's what these are for, right? To learn. We've all probably seen the Code of Ethics for EMS practitioners. The codes of ethics actually started back in the 30s, 1938, I believe, is when the government started talking about ethics and how code of ethics needed to take place. Really, the first one documented similar to this for a profession was in the 50s. So if you start to research code of ethics, and you can go to the National Institutes of Health, and there are many different codes of ethics for the various healthcare areas, you can see all of those. But really, what is it? Have you seen this in our books in the recent years? They stopped printing this. So it was written by the National Association of EMTs, by Dr. Gillespie. Do you have it posted in your room? It's our responsibility to teach the students about ethics, and we cannot assume that they have learned this at home. So really it's up to us. And I like their update back in 2013 when they updated it using social media. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but social media, it has to be in there. When you're looking at ethics, the medical law and ethics, ethics is a branch of philosophy that's related to morals, where we would put common good above our own self-interests. Morality, being virtuous or practice the right conduct. And medical ethics is based on principles that regulate the behavior of healthcare professionals. So let's look at some ethical theories. Utilitarianism. An ethical theory is doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Final outcomes on the welfare of society. Rights-based ethics. Person's individual rights, protect them from injury, being that patient advocate. Duty-based ethics, acts that should be universal under the same circumstances, the duty to keep promises, be truthful, so on. An honest person. And then justice-based ethics, moral restraint. We would not see the recipient or have subjective information. In a couple situations we could think of with justice-based would be the veil of ignorance. Who should receive an organ in donation? Should it be someone that has a questionable history, maybe? Is that really something to consider when somebody needs an organ? What are the circumstances for that? If it's a child, maybe an injured child, a critical child, would a helicopter maybe decide to go ahead and fly even though the weather is questionable if they knew the situation they had to fly to? So those are justice-based ethics. Virtue-based ethics, emphasis on people, good habits, character traits, those kind of things. And then we can look at ethical principles, beneficence, the action of helping others and performing actions that will benefit someone else. Empathy, objective awareness of feeling and emotions. Fidelity, being loyal and faithful. Gentleness, mild, tenderhearted. Holistic is a total care approach. Humility, unpretentious. Justice, fairness in all of our actions with other people. Perseverance, persistence with a task. Responsibility would be accountability. Tolerance, respect for others' opinions, practices, and differences. I think all of us could use a little more of that in recent times. And work, an effort applied toward an end goal. Those are the ethical principles. So let's look at this scenario. Scenario number 2. You have a 48-year-old, we would not call a frequent flyer, we should be calling them super utilizers. They have an odor of alcohol on their breath. They do want to go to the ER and even say that they have the best sandwiches at that particular emergency room. Your student mentions that on their clinical, they did the following with this scenario. The lead medic told the patient that they do not need to go to the hospital. They did not get a refusal signature, and there were no other witnesses other than your student and the crew that they were riding with. So what kind of a learning opportunity is this? While you can advise the student what should have happened, do you take this further? Puts us instructors or program directors, our leaders, in a tough situation. Do we have the moral obligation to report it to the clinical service? Could this cause a rift with the clinical site? Will your students in the future be treated in a negative manner due to this? These are all things to think about when you're dealing with these type of scenarios. This is something that actually happened. Word for word, this happened to one of my students. And we did go to the clinical site. They did not have any repercussions from that on future site or future clinical rotations, but it is something to consider and something that would maybe make someone hesitate and instead just talk to the student and say why that shouldn't have happened and how you could do better in the future. But really that medic and that partner needed to understand that that just is not how you do things and how to get better. So let's look at the 3-step ethics model. There's 3 questions. Is it legal? Not just with the law, but with your organizational regulations. Is it fair and balanced? Would the decision be seen as honest and honorable? And then the last question is, how does it make me feel? Meaning, are you hesitant to discuss maybe a question that came up or a situation that came up? Do you have a bad feeling? I often tell people, if you're asking me if you should do something, it's because you have a question in your mind that you probably should not, or vice versa, whatever the question is. So if that makes you to hesitate, causes you to hesitate, that's what you have to think of when you're discussing ethics. So what ethics is not about how you feel. It's not about the sincerity of your beliefs, and it's not about emotional responses. We judge others by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. Maybe when we're getting our information, what if we heard their intentions before we started to judge their actions? Several years ago, I had a coworker who failed the registry cognitive exam, the paramedic exam. By error, from the state, they issued a license. That was clearly an error. When she received that license, she called me. You know, we were really shorthanded on medics at that time. She seemed to be very knowledgeable and proficient in the field. Do you see a temptation there? Maybe the emotional response of, well, I know what I'm doing. I just couldn't pass that test, but the state gave me a license anyway. So what would have happened to her if she would have kept it? She obviously did the right thing and immediately notified the state, mailed the license back. But what if she hadn't? How could that have affected her life forever? Well, she certainly would have lost her license when it was found, and those errors do come to light. So would have lost her license. The agency would have had to have paid back every call she had attended as a paramedic because she was not a licensed paramedic. And then in addition, just probably not been allowed to ever be a medic or a healthcare professional in our state again. So you can see the fallouts of not doing the right thing. And we really have to work on that. Emotionally, she felt ready to be a medic. Emotionally, maybe the service felt like she was ready to be a medic. Really, and honestly, she was not. She could not pass the entry-level exam. She did on the next try, though. So I did a simple Google search yesterday, and I just wanted to know EMS lawsuit cases. And if you can see the top of this slide, shows about 745,000 results. Very easy to run this. It's very easy to get some case law that is going on in your state or has had some outcomes. How much time do you really spend with students discussing this topic? When you're back in the medical legal phase at the beginning of class, do you really spend time with this? Do you show them examples of EMS professionals who have had an issue, who have gone through a lawsuit? Is there somebody you can call to have them come in to talk about it? That's always good information. Or maybe a lawyer that is familiar with EMS that handles these things. Most likely you can find case law in your own state. And I could have, of course, narrowed these searches down. This was really, it took 2 seconds to Google it and to find that many hits on it. So questions to ask: how much does it cost someone to defend themselves? Attorney's fees, loss of work, potential loss of license. We have to spend more time in the classroom on these kind of things. And we all know that a very high number of lawsuits comes from refusal of care and transport. How much time do you spend with your students on that? It's so important to get that message across. So let's talk about ethics committees, bioethics, QA programs or QI programs. Do you have that in your program? Do you have a committee there that works on this? Bioethics is just practical ethics, moral dilemmas, issues prevalent today. Ethics committees should be various diverse members that can help examine patient care issues. It's a powerful committee, an ethics committee is. And then quality assurance. Can you really assure quality? Kind of why we moved away from that word and went more towards improvement, because we can always work on improvement. Maybe you can work on this if you don't have an ethics committee in your classroom or your education program. It would not hurt to start working on that. NHTSA, the EMS.gov, I spend a lot of time on their website. The DOT instructor curriculum, of course, that was written in 2002, the national guidelines for educating EMS instructors. And they have quite a bit in there on affective goals. Affective evaluations, affective goals. The goals are the values. It values ongoing assessment is essential to the instructional process, recognizing that there are many different assessment strategies accurately and systematically used are necessary to monitor and promote student learning. And that is committed to using assessment to identify student strengths and promote student growth rather than to deny that adult learner access to learning opportunities. And then it goes through in the general professional educator characteristics. So possessing integrity and honesty is number one. Being empathetic and compassionate. These are all kind of the same words that we've already gone over. Highly self-motivated. Maintains a professional appearance with good personal hygiene. Have you ever taken a class and walked in and found the instructor very disheveled? It's very disappointing when you walk in and see that. Be a professional. You're promoting professionalism, so it starts with us. Being self-confident. There's a difference between self-confident and cocky. Possesses clear verbal and written communication skills. Exhibits effective time management. Advocates the teamwork approach for teaching and for student interaction. They're diplomatic and respectful when dealing with others. Has the desire to continue the improvement process, growing professionally, intellectually. The lifelong learning is very important because that's what we are. We're lifelong learners. And possessing the knowledge of the subject and content areas, not allowing the students to learn twice from the book. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, is that you tell your student to read chapter 10 before they come to class, and then you reread them chapter 10 from the publisher's slide bank. And then last, but certainly not least, is they are a student advocate. So why do we need to do affective evaluations on students? How many of you that are on this webinar, and I know if I could see you, you're going to raise your hand, but how many of you know someone who should not be in this field simply because of their attitude or the way that they treat others? Like I said, I know everybody's raising their hand. The deal is that we're not all talking about the same person. There's that many. So would you be comfortable having that person that we're talking about take care of a family member of yours who needed help? It's our responsibility to be accurate and consistent with affective evaluations on all of our students. It's part of the course completion, having passed that affective evaluation. And no student should pass without that, having a competent affective evaluation. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. Again, a lot of words with leadership: success, achievement, innovation, trusting, manager, achieve, authority, responsibility, social behavior. All educators are leaders, and we have to be good leaders to have successful students. So an educator is a leader, a field training officer, a supervisor, a manager, a director. We're all leaders, and that's what we have to focus on. We may all have different styles in our relay of information. Students are going to remember you forever. So don't be that guy, and I'm air quoting that. Don't be that guy. We have to set a good example for our people, for our partners, for our public. We all want to be respected, but do we deserve it? And that's where our good leaders come out. So here is the next scenario. Your student tells you that they smelled alcohol on their clinical preceptor's breath last night. How do you handle this? So your student asked that person if they had been drinking, and they denied drinking. So how do you handle this? Again, you go back to obviously discussing it with the clinical site probably wish that student would have contacted you last night when it happened, but you're talking about the safety of your student as well as the clinical side. It's a touchy situation. I've had that situation as a supervisor with one of our medics who came in smelling like that and was. So there's so many things to consider with this. But if your student comes to you, do you have a plan put together? How are you going to approach that subject with the clinical site? And then further on, if they keep that medic there, is that medic going to have any retaliation? Are they going to be precepting your students? Do you feel comfortable with that? Those are all ethical considerations to take in when you're discussing those things. So an authentic leader is a responsible leader. It would be someone who aligns people around you, that has a common purpose, that unites people with a common set of values, that empowers others to step up and lead. And then the dialogue is in constant dialogue with all. They bear the responsibility. They take accountability or responsibility for any actions. That's what a true leader is. One of my favorite books in the world is Discover Your True North by Craig George and Snook. You can see the reference here. There's so much in this book, and it's a personal guide to becoming an authentic leader. I highly recommend it. The end of the slideshow, I have my reference list if you would like to take a snapshot of it. So when you talk about leadership, you're talking about your path of life. What lessons have you learned? How do you make decisions? And then, are you one of three things? Are you a hero? Are you a victim? Or are you a knowledgeable bystander? So are you the kind of leader who reacts on emotion, or do you think first and then act later? A caring, knowledgeable bystander is better than a hero. A hero misses out on what they need to work on. Are you a victim? If you're a victim, you miss out on what your strengths are. So those are nice leadership lessons in the path of life. What lessons have you learned? So here is one that I often do in my classes when I'm talking about ethics and leadership, is I have all of my students in those classes to either write down on a piece of paper or on their tablet or laptop, what are 5 qualities of a good leader that you have personally experienced? And then on the next page, what are 5 qualities of a bad leader? Because there's many lessons that can be learned from both, right? As you think about leadership, consider these 5 qualities for each. You can learn just as much from a bad leader as you do a good leader. They're just different lessons. What type of leader are you? As you dig a little deeper, where do you stand on your good leadership attributes and your attributes that need improvement? How can you implement changes to improve on those skills? Do you work on these qualities? Ethics.org, if you go to that website, they have some great information and work projects that are available for free to help you obtain a better understanding on improving in areas that are needed. Again, it's ethics.org, and they really do have a lot of resources. Ways that how you can not be if you see those qualities of a bad leader, and ways that you can turn those bad leadership examples that you've had into a positive learning role and improvement guideline for you. So highly recommend it. So of course we haven't talked about cheating yet. Cheating is something that we've all dealt with at some point. There are so many ways to cheat. You may have to rethink your cheating policies that you currently have in your syllabus or your policy manual based on online learning. Do you have anything on there for that? How do you discuss this with students? Do you have a 100% no cheat policy? Are they booted immediately from your class? Can they re-enter your class next year if you do boot them? So the cheating policy needs to be placed on your syllabus, and you have to cover that on the first day of class. You just have to. Cheating is prevalent. Maybe a little easier nowadays. So let's go to this slide. This slide is a scenario on cheating. A student comes to you and says they overheard another student talk about someone else taking their quiz or exam online. How do you handle this one? The student then says that if you talk to the one in question, the one who said it, that they're going to know where it came from, and they're afraid of retaliation. So if you refer back to day one in class, what are your policies on cheating? Do you treat everyone equally, as you should? Are there extenuating circumstances that made someone cheat? And then do you talk about it freely in class? Would you trust this person who you know cheated in the classroom later on? Or if you found out that they took care of one of your family members? Those are all areas that we have to consider as educators in the classroom. Most that I know of have a 100% no cheat policy, and that's cool, as long as they follow that. Not everyone does, especially when you start to hear the subjective information. You know, I've worked a ton of hours, I'm really tired, I didn't have a chance to get the quiz done, I just gave somebody my username and password and they did it, or somebody told me the questions that you were going to ask, you know, and I've been taking care of my sick parents and so on. Everyone has a story. If you have a 100% no cheat policy, that subjective information should never come into play. It's just 100% no cheating allowed. So those are things to consider when you're setting up your day one, your classroom management situation. So now let's talk about social media, because we all need to have a social media policy. Do you have one currently? What is okay to post and what is not okay to post on social media of your students? What if someone comes to you and says that a student made a post with patient identifiers? Does that get them booted from the class? A student writes poorly about another student on social media, or a student reveals questions and answers regarding a test. A student writes badly about you. You find out later that there are some negative comments toward you as the instructor or the program director. So what is your policy? If you haven't looked at that recently, it's probably a good time to do that. Remind students about their ethical responsibilities. While we do have our First Amendment rights that allow us to speak freely, there are still limitations to what we can do. Obviously, patient identifiers violates patient confidentiality laws, HIPAA laws as well. That may even be out of your hands. The agency that treated or transported that patient that they posted about would force you to either get rid of the student or not allow them at their place again. And then legally, what kind of legal problems can you or they get into simply with giving out patient identifiers? Can set everybody up for failure and for problems. So one of my favorite books, the NAEMSE educator book, The Foundations of Education, in the 3rd edition, have in there about 6 elements of professionalism. So when you're talking about professionalism, you know, professionals subordinate their own interests to the interest of others. Professionals adhere to the highest ethical and moral standards. They respond to social needs, and their behaviors reflect a social contract with the communities served. Professionals demonstrate core humanistic values, including honesty, integrity, caring, compassion, and so forth. They exercise accountability for themselves and for colleagues. And then they demonstrate a continuing commitment to excellence. We all have areas that we can improve in, and focusing on those, really getting to know those, maybe even why you do some of those things, where you can improve, just to become a better person. I always say, come on, let's just be better people. Professionals exhibit a commitment to scholarship and to advancing their field of study. Professionals deal with high levels of complexity and uncertainty, and then they reflect on their actions and decisions. Like I said, it comes from the Foundations of Education, 3rd edition by NAEMSE. And now I'm going to just talk about the 6 pillars of a character. And I'm going to ask you do you have these posted around the room? Have you talked about them with not just your students, but with everyone in your life? I have this printed and I have it posted everywhere. Trustworthiness or honesty, respect, tolerant and accepting, the responsibility to be vigilant and persevere, fairness or playing by the rules, caring, being kind and compassionate, and citizenship, do your share, be a good neighbor. Like I said, I print one of these off and post it in my classroom. I have one in my office. Have your students talk about the 6 pillars of character. How do they want to be remembered? When all is said and done, how do you want to be remembered? That's what one of the things I think is important to discuss with everyone. How do you want to be remembered? And then I promised you the resource page. These are my resources. I am a little fast. I must have been talking too fast today. The character counts is where I got the 6 pillars of character. Very good source. They have a lot of good information about character there as well. Just like the ethics.org, you can find a lot of information. And then lastly, I'm going to give you my contact information. So if you have any questions or suggestions for improvement of this, generally I do this in our state, and just recently did one with our educators, and a lot of the information I had was specific to some maybe complaints or concerns regarding things that I had gotten throughout the year. But ethics is a very important subject, and it's one that we have to spend a lot of time focusing on in the classroom. Like I said, I start my year out, I start my classes out with an ethical scenario. And they'll have other scenarios around the room where they'll go in groups of a few, and we cover ethical scenarios quite a bit throughout the class. But I always start with one because I want them to learn in the beginning of class why it's important to do the right thing. So, and to take responsibility. And most of the time, when you make a mistake, if you own it, can work on improving it and moving on and not making that mistake again. But Nate, that is all I have for this. I know that Nate and I were discussing code of ethics earlier, and I think I said when I was on the code of ethics, kind of when code of ethics began, the website I went to was the National Institutes of Health. And they have a lot of information for the various professions and their code of ethics, and not just the code of ethics themselves, but they do a review of those as well, and peer-reviewed papers on their code of ethics, and it's a great resource to get into. So I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm not sure if we can open this up for questions. but I would be willing to take some if anyone has any.
Do you have any way, like if you could speak to how we could maintain this in your distance education practices, or how you can try to keep a group together and be able to push these concepts to people, whether that's starting every lesson with a discussion of these topics or something, running scenarios at a distance that might be able to enforce these topics with your students?
That's great, Nate. When I did our one for our statewide instructors, probably a couple months ago, I had a lot of comments from the participants who said, let's all get together and we can write our own scenarios together as a group, and then we can network with all the instructors around the state and get these scenarios out so that they can start implementing them in the classroom. And I highly recommend doing that. If you belong to a group, if you have a group of instructors, anyone, it doesn't just have to be in our state, for sure. I would be glad to participate in that and to help create ethical scenarios that we can utilize in the classroom and for all levels of EMS. It's not just EMTs and paramedics. We have 4 different levels, and really 5 if you're considering our instructors, our educators. Those are great ones to come up with too. Like I said, the consistency part is one that I get a lot of complaints about from students, that their instructors are not consistent. So maybe in our educational programs for our educators, that we can come up with some of those type of scenarios where you just work on getting those again. Somebody asked if I could share my resources again. I sure can. There we are.
Perfect. It is up for everyone to see now.
Okay, good. So while I have that up, I can't see if anyone has any questions, so I can.
We do have a comment. Someone shared their experience saying that they teach in a high school where they start with 9th graders. And at the start of each class in the program, they cover the mission and vision statement, core values, and developing a team-based classroom norm that's posted in the classroom. I don't know if you have anything that you could speak to that, or maybe even how to start with this with a group that's younger, like in high school.
You know, I taught for several years. I taught a high school EMT class. They were seniors though, not freshmen. Yes. One thing that I've been working with my husband's fire department recently, creating their mission, vision, and values statements. And I was so disappointed when we started, you know, looking around and doing some research. We asked different people from different departments, what is your mission statement? How many people do not know what whoever they work for, they don't know what the mission statement is. And that's just sad to me. I'm glad to hear that somebody is working on that, because that's just something we should all know. Wherever you work, you should know what that mission is, what their vision is, and what their core values are, for sure. So if you create one in your class, I think that's fantastic, and work with that with your students. I think that's fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, if anyone has any questions or anything else that you want to submit, we are more than welcome, more than happy to stay on and talk about any of those. But so far, I think we've done a great job of covering everybody's questions and comments that we've received. I do want to thank you again for joining us today. This has been really valuable information that I know a lot of people are going to really benefit from hearing. And as you've mentioned, not necessarily talked about all the time as much as it probably should be. So I'm really happy that you were able to take some time to shed some light on these topics. I did share a link in the chat if anybody is, once we do wrap up this presentation. Actually, I shouldn't sign off right now. We have a question in the chat. Do you have your students or organizations sign a culture statement, or putting down their signature on that?
Lance, that's a good question. You know, I never had that, but you know, we have to start working on that. And one area that we're working on here in our state is a lot on implicit bias. And with that is just learning other cultures and learning more about ourselves and maybe some biases that we have. And we as educators have some biases as well, to work on that. But yeah, that's a great idea, is to have them sign a culture statement.
Wonderful. So if you, as I said just a second ago, if you have anything, please go ahead and send those in. Also, I will include your contact information in the follow-up email along with the link for CEUs and everything, and all of the some of the references that we've included in this presentation. I'll include all of that stuff in the follow-up email. So go ahead and look out for all that, and you'll have direct links to all of those resources. But do you have anything that you want to go ahead and say before we sign off today?
I think I'm good. I really appreciate you guys allowing me to speak today. I am passionate about ethics and professionalism and leadership, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this information.